December 5th, 1941. Outside Moscow, the temperature is 40 degrees below zero. German Panzer Commander Heinz Guderian stands in the freezing darkness, watching his tanks refuse to start. Their engines are frozen solid. The lubricants have turned to paste. Around him, soldiers wrap their feet in newspaper and rags, their standard-issue boots useless against the Siberian cold that has descended on the Russian winter. 12 miles. Ahead lies Moscow. The Kremlin is visible on clear days. They can almost touch it. Then, through the pre-dawn darkness, comes a sound that will haunt Guderian for the rest of his life. Artillery. Thousands of guns opening fire simultaneously. The flash of muzzles lighting up the horizon like a terrible dawn. The Red Army counteroffensive has begun. What Guderian does, I know almost no one knows yet, is that this moment marks the beginning of the end. The greatest military machine ever assembled is about to be broken across 1,200 kilometers of frozen steppe. The road from this moment will lead, inexorably, through 3.5 years of blood and fire, all the way to Berlin. This is the story of how the Soviet Union, reeling from catastrophic losses, transformed defeat into the most devastating counteroffensive in military history. It's the story of how over 30 million people died to travel 900 miles westward. It's the story of the longest, bloodiest campaign ever fought the Eastern Front. From the gates of Moscow to the ruins of the Reichstag, the Colossus awakens. 6 months earlier, everything looked different. June 22nd, 1941. Dawn's clear and warm across Soviet-occupied Poland. At 3:15 a.m., over 3.8 million Axis troops invade the Western Soviet Union along a 2,900-kilometer front. It is the largest invasion force in human history. The offensive is codenamed Operation Barbarossa, after the medieval German emperor who drowned leading the Third Crusade. Adolf Hitler has assembled 150 divisions, 3,000 aircraft, 3,580 tanks, and 7,000 artillery pieces. His plan is simple. Crush the Red Army in 6 weeks, before winter. The Soviet Union, he believes, is a rotten structure that will collapse the moment you kick in the door. For the first hours, he appears to be right. On the first day of the attack alone, the Luftwaffe manages to shoot down more than 1,000 Soviet aircraft. Most are destroyed on the ground before their pilots can even reach them. Soviet communications networks disintegrate. Command and control collapses. Entire armies are surrounded and annihilated in massive encirclement battles. By late September, German forces have advanced over 600 miles. Kiev falls. Smolensk falls. German forces capture more than 500,000 Soviet soldiers in a single massive encirclement around the Ukrainian capital, in Leningrad. German and Finnish forces begin a siege that will last 872 days and kill over 1 million people through starvation and bombardment. The numbers are staggering. By December 1941, the Soviet Union has lost approximately 5 million soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. It's more casualties than any nation has ever suffered in such a short time. The Red Army is bleeding to death. And yet, it doesn't break. Stalin makes a crucial decision. Unlike the French in 1940, unlike every other nation Germany has invaded, the Soviets will not surrender. They will trade space for time. They will retreat, burn everything behind them, and force the Wehrmacht to extend its supply lines across vast distances. They will fight in every city, every village, every field. Moscow becomes the line they will not cross. The winter strikes back. By early December, German advance units are within 12 miles of the Kremlin. They can see the city through their binoculars. Some soldiers cross the Moscow-Volga Canal. They are the farthest east the German army will ever reach. But the offensive has stalled. By the end of November, more German troops are in hospital with frostbite than with wounds. They were marched equipped for a 6-week summer campaign. Faces the coldest European winter of the 20th century, wearing summer uniforms. Diesel fuel gels in tank engines. Machine guns freeze. Soldiers burn furniture from abandoned homes just to stay alive. The Red Army, meanwhile, has been preparing. Stalin receives intelligence from his spy in Tokyo. Reacher Sorhe. That Japan will not attack the Soviet Union. This means he can transfer divisions from Siberia hardened troops, equipped and trained for winter warfare. By early December, Stalin has transferred over 18 divisions, 1,700 tanks, and over 1,500 aircraft from Siberia and the Far East. December 5, 1941. The Soviet counteroffensive begins. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the defender of Moscow, unleashes 1,100,000 men against the exhausted German forces. Soviet troops, many wearing white winter camouflage, materialize out of the snow. German positions that haven't been reinforced or resupplied in weeks collapse under the assault. General Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Army, flies to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia to request permission to retreat. Hitler refuses. The Führer issues a stand-fast order. Every soldier must hold their position to the death, not one step backward. It's a catastrophic decision. German divisions, unable to maneuver, are enveloped and destroyed in detail. Soviet forces push the Wehrmacht back between 100 and 250 kilometers from Moscow. The myth of German invincibility dies in the snow. The Germans suffer over 750,000 casualties during Operation Barbarossa, with some 200,000 men killed. For the first time since the war began, Hitler's armies are in retreat. The question now is whether the Soviets can keep pushing. The city that wouldn't die, Hitler, stung by the Moscow defeat, pivoted south in 1942. His new objective: the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city named after his greatest enemies. The battle that unfolds there will become synonymous with the horror of the Eastern Front. The Battle of Stalingrad lasts from the 17th of July 1942 to the 2nd of February 1943. It begins with a Luftwaffe bombing campaign that reduces most of the city to rubble. Paradoxically, this helps the defenders. The ruins provide cover. Every building becomes a fortress. Every street a killing ground. General Vasily Zhukov, commanding the Soviet 62nd Army, inside the city, implements a doctrine called hugging, keeping Soviet forces so close to German positions that the Luftwaffe cannot bomb without hitting its own troops. Fighting occurs room by room, floor by floor, sometimes within the same building. A Soviet platoon might hold a second floor while Germans occupy the third. The city's most famous landmark, the Mamayev Kurgan Hill, changes hands multiple times, but is piled so high that the winter snow can't cover them. The Volga River runs red. Hitler becomes obsessed. He pours more and more divisions into the urban meat grinder, convinced that capturing the city bearing Stalin's name will deliver a psychological knockout blow. Stalin, equally obsessed, orders the city defended at all costs. Neither dictator will accept the military logic suggesting they cut their losses. By November, the German 6th Army, under Friedrich Paulus, has pushed deep into the city, but the effort has exhausted them. The Hungarian 2nd Army is given the task of defending a 200-kilometer section of the front north of Stalingrad. Impossibly long line for their forces. Soviet planners see the opportunity. The German spearhead is overextended. Its flanks are protected by Romanian and Hungarian armies less experienced, more poorly equipped than German troops. November 19th, 1942. The Soviets launch Operation Uranus. 1.2 million Soviet soldiers drive into the weakly guarded flanks of the German 6th Army. Within 4 days, they've encircled 300,000 Axis troops in a frozen pocket around Stalingrad. Hermann K., Marine commander of the Luftwaffe, promises Hitler they can supply their trapped army by air. It's a catastrophic miscalculation. The Luftwaffe needs to deliver 500 tons of supplies daily. They never manage more than 100. German soldiers inside the pocket begin starving. Temperatures plunge to minus 30 degrees Celsius. On the 24th of January, Paulus reports to Hitler 18,000 wounded without the slightest aid of bandages and medicines. Hitler promotes Paulus to Field Marshal. None too subtle reminder that no German field marshal has ever surrendered. On January 31st, 1943, Paulus surrenders anyway. Axis casualties during the Battle of Stalingrad are estimated at around 800,000, including those missing or captured. Soviet forces are estimated to have suffered 1,100,000 casualties. Of the 91,000 German soldiers who surrender, only 6,000 will ever see Germany again. Stalingrad historian David Glantz notes, "If you look at the whole operation, the Soviets essentially wiped out the German 6th Army and a Panzer Army, leaving a massive hole in the Eastern Front. The tide has turned permanently. The hammer blow by summer 1944, the Eastern Front stretches from the Baltic to the Black Sea, nearly 1,800 miles. The Wehrmacht has been retreating for 18 months, fighting desperate defensive actions, trading lives for time. But they still hold a massive salient in Belarusia, bulging eastward like a tumor in the Soviet front lines. The Germans call it the Belarusian balcony. The Soviets call it a trap." June 22, 1944. Exactly 3 years after Operation Barbarossa began, Stalin launches Operation Bagration. It's named for a Russian general who died fighting Napoleon at Borodino in 1812. The symbolism is intentional. What follows is arguably the greatest military defeat of all time. The Soviets have learned from 3 years of bitter warfare. They employ Maskirovka military deception on an unprecedented scale. They leave 4 tank armies visible in Ukraine, convincing German intelligence the main offensive will come there. Hitler, buying the deception, redeploys 1/3 of Army Group Center's artillery, 1/2 their tank destroyers and 88% of their tanks to the southern front. Army Group Center, holding the Belarusian salient, is left dangerously exposed. June 23, 1944. The Soviets attack with 166 divisions on a 450-mile front. German commanders, expecting a limited offensive, are stunned by the scope of the assault. Soviet artillery fires a bombardment that can be heard 100 miles away. Partisan forces behind German lines blow up railway tracks and bridges, cutting supply and communication lines. The German defensive line disintegrates. Within 5 days, the Red Army has killed and captured tens of thousands. Soviet armor breaks through into open country, implementing deep battle doctrine, penetrating far behind enemy lines, encircling entire divisions, preventing any organized retreat. The city of Minsk, defended by Hitler as a fortress city that must never be abandoned, falls in days. Stalin parades the 50,000 German prisoners of war captured at Minsk through Moscow in July 1944 to demonstrate to the world and to his Western allies the scale of Soviet victory. By August 19th, when Operation Bagration officially ends, 28 of Army Group Center's 38 divisions have been destroyed. Official German losses are cited as 26,000 killed, 110,000 wounded, and 263,000 captured or missing. No, the actual death toll is likely much higher, as many missing soldiers were never found. Soviet casualties are also horrific. 180,000 killed and missing and more than 500,000 wounded. But the strategic impact is undeniable. The Red Army has advanced 400 to 500 kilometers in 23 days, an average of 20 kilometers per day. Soviet forces now stand on the Vistula River, just across from Warsaw and within striking distance of Berlin. The war has come home to Germany, the road to the Reichstag. By April 1945, the Third Reich is dying. In the West, American and British forces have crossed the Rhine. In Italy, the Germans are in full retreat. In the East, Soviet forces have liberated Poland, reached the Oder River, and established bridgeheads just 60 kilometers from Berlin. Hitler, living in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, issues increasingly delusional orders. Phantom armies that exist only on paper are commended to Die Volkssturm, a peopless militia composed of boys as young as 12 and men as old as 60 are sent to face Soviet tanks with Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets. The professional German army, once 3 million strong, is a shadow of its former self. April 16th, 1945. The Red Army launches its final offensive with more than 1.5 million soldiers. Stalin has pitted his 2 greatest marshals, Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Kunov, against each other in a race for Berlin. Both men want the glory of capturing the Nazi capital. Soviet artillery along the Oder River unleashes a thunderous bombardment that reverberates 40 miles away on the outskirts of Berlin. The first major obstacle is the Silo Heights, the last defensive line protecting Berlin. German forces have prepared elaborate fortifications. For 4 days, close to 1 million Soviet soldiers and more than 20,000 tanks Battle about 100,000 German soldiers and 1,200 tanks. Soviet casualties are appalling, more than 2,807 tanks lost between April 1st and 19th, including at least 727 at the Silo Heights, but sheer weight of numbers prevails. The German line breaks. By April 25th, Soviet forces have completely encircled Berlin. Inside the city, the battle becomes apocalyptic. Soviet T-34 tanks rumble through streets, crushing defensive barriers, their cannons blasting buildings at point-blank range. German defenders, a mix of Wehrmacht remnants, Waffen-SS fanatics, and terrified Volkssturm conscripts fight from building to building, subway tunnel to subway tunnel. The Red Army fights with a fury born of 4 years of suffering. Soviet soldiers have seen their homeland burned, their cities destroyed, their people enslaved and murdered. Now, they exact revenge. An estimated 100,000 women in Berlin are raped as Soviet forces overrun the city. It's a crime committed in the fog of war's most brutal endgame. April 30th, 1945. Soviet forces assault the Reichstag, the old German parliament building. About 1,000 defenders, a mixture of sailors, SS and Hitler Youth, fight from inside the half-ruined structure. Soviet troops force their way in, fighting room by room, floor by floor, through smoke and rubble. That same day, in his bunker below the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler marries Eva Braun in a brief ceremony. Then he dictates his political testament, blaming everyone but himself for Germany's defeat. At approximately 3:30 p.m., Hitler shoots himself while Eva Braun takes poison. Their bodies are carried to the Chancellery Garden and burned in a shell crater. May 2nd, 1945, Heinrich Helmuth, Weidling, commander of Berlin's defense, surrenders to the Red Army. The Battle of Berlin is over. The Red Army suffered some 350,000 casualties, with at least 450,000 German military casualties, and an estimated 300,000 civilians killed or wounded. On the roof of the Reichstag, a Red Army soldier, Mikhail Minin, raises the Soviet victory banner. Photographer Yevgeny Kalday captures the image that will become iconic. A soldier planting the red flag above the ruins of Nazi Germany. The war in Europe is over. The price of victory, the journey from Moscow to Berlin, covered approximately 1,600 kilometers, as the crow flies. But the Red Army didn't travel as the crow flies. They fought for every kilometer. They died for every city, every village, every nameless field. The numbers defy comprehension. Over 25 million Soviet citizens died throughout the war. That is more than the entire population of Australia in 1945. It is more than the combined military and civilian deaths of the United States, Britain, France, and all Western Allied nations combined, approximately 8.7 million. Red Army soldiers were killed in combat 3 times more than the entire German military death toll on all fronts. Another 2.5 million Soviet posts were murdered in German captivity, deliberately starved or worked to death. Behind the front lines, Nazi occupation policies turned Eastern Europe into a charnel house. Villages were burned, entire populations were massacred. In Belarusia alone, 1/4 of the population died. The Battle of Stalingrad killed more Soviet soldiers than America lost in the entire war across all theaters. Operation Bagration inflicted more German casualties in 8 weeks than D-Day and the entire Normandy campaign combined. These weren't just numbers. They were individuals, families, futures erased. But the Soviet Union survived, more than survived it. Triumphed. The Red Army that staggered back from the gates of Moscow in 1941, disorganized and reeling, became by 1945 the most powerful military force on Earth. They developed combat arms doctrine, mastered operational maneuver, coordinated massive offensives across thousands of kilometers. They learned to absorb casualties that would have shattered any other nation and keep fighting. The transformation was purchased with blood. The long shadow when Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag on May 2nd, 1945. They're standing at the end of the longest and deadliest campaign in military history. The road from Moscow to Berlin consumed 4 years, 3 months, and 12 days. It devoured empires and ideologies. It killed more human beings than any other military conflict in history. For the Soviet Union, the victory came to be known as the Great Patriotic War, a sacred memory of suffering and triumph that would define Soviet and Russian identity for generations. May 9th victory. Day remains the most important holiday in Russia, commemorating not just military achievement but national survival. For Germany, the Eastern Front became a nightmare from which the nation would not fully awaken for decades. The Wehrmacht, once considered the finest army in the world, was utterly destroyed. The myth of Aryan supremacy drowned in the blood of 4.5 million German soldiers killed fighting the Soviet Union. The war proved several uncomfortable truths. It demonstrated that industrial capacity, population reserves, and sheer determination could overcome initial tactical superiority. It showed that democracies and totalitarian states could collaborate when faced with an existential threat. It revealed that modern war had become total war, a conflict, not just between armies, but between entire societies, where civilians died in numbers equal to or greater than soldiers. The Eastern Front also set the stage for the Cold War. Soviet forces occupying Eastern Europe in 1945 would not leave for 45 years. The line where Western and Soviet forces met became the Iron Curtain, dividing Europe into hostile camps. The alliance that defeated Hitler dissolved into mutual suspicion within months of victory. One cannot understand the 20th century without understanding the Eastern Front. It was the crucible in which the modern world was forged. Epilogue. The measure of men. Return to that frozen morning, outside Moscow, December 5th, 1941. Heinz Guderian, watching his tanks refuse to start, Soviet artillery lighting up the darkness. In that moment, Guderian believes he's experiencing a temporary setback, a delay in the inevitable German victory. He doesn't yet understand that he is witnessing the beginning of a catastrophe that will consume his army, his nation, and millions of lives. 3.5 years later, Guderian would be one of the few senior German officers to survive the war. He would write memoirs attempting to explain how the Wehrmacht, the most powerful military machine ever created, was ground to pieces across the vastness of Russia. His answer, like Hitler's, focused on external factors: the weather, the distances, the unexpected Soviet resistance. What he couldn't quite articulate was the deeper truth. The Soviet Union survived because its people willed it. They endured suffering beyond imagination, starvation, occupation, mass murder, and fought back, not because they loved Stalin's regime, but because they refused to be enslaved. They understood, in a way their leaders sometimes did not, that this was a war of annihilation. Surrender meant death. Defeat meant extinction. So, they fought. In destroyed factories, workers produced tanks and aircraft around the clock. In partisan bands, behind German lines, civilians sabotaged supply lines and gathered intelligence. In the ruble of Stalingrad, soldiers held their positions when retreat would have been sensible. At Kursk, tank crews rammed their vehicles into German Panthers when they ran out of ammunition. The road from Moscow to Berlin was paved with choice as millions of individual decisions to resist, to endure, to keep fighting, when every rational calculation said it was hopeless. And in the end, they won. The victory cost them everything. But they won. The ruins of Berlin stand as monument to that terrible, costly triumph, the moment when the colossus that Hitler awakened finally reached the heart of the Reich and planted its flag in the ashes of its enemy's capital. The longest road, the highest price, the most complete victory. From Moscow to Berlin, humanity's bloodiest journey, and the war that decided the 20th century.